Welcome to Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I'm here with Dr. Jeffery Rediger. And Dr. Rediger is a physician, a best-selling author, and a popular speaker. He's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the medical director at McLean Southeast Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital in Boston. A physician and a psychiatrist, Jeffery also has a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. His research with remarkable individuals who have recovered from incurable illnesses received wide recognition and praise from many sources. And today I'll be talking to him about that research and about his work. Jeffery has been nominated for the National Bravewell Leadership Award and has received numerous awards related to leadership and patient care. His best-selling book, which is what we'll be talking about, is Cured: The Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing. And so welcome, Jeffery. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We're going to jump into this conversation. I realize the book has been out for a while and it's done well. So you've been in lots of conversations, I'm sure. But I have some specific things I want to talk about. But I want to start with sort of the biggest framework, which is the skepticism about spontaneous healing. And, often both the doctors and patients, because I've seen people in therapy that have had spontaneous healing and then they've doubted their diagnosis. But many people will bring a kind of skepticism that doubts this kind of spontaneous recovery as either a mistaken diagnosis or a sort of fluke, like there's some kind of fluke. But you've taken a different approach in studying cases, which is very similar to studying the cases of near-death experience. To study cases is a scientific approach. It's not just the double-blind design that makes for science. It's the predictability and the character of repetition. And so I'd like you to tell us about, how you got into studying cases, why you study them, and what you think about the science connected to spontaneous healing.
Yes. So I'll take that question in parts, and then you can remind me or help me zero in on the kind of way of talking about this that's most useful to your listeners. I got into this back in 2002 when an oncology nurse at Mass General came to me and said that she had just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She wanted my help as a psychiatrist explaining this to her son so that he could understand what she was dealing with, that she was going to die, etc. Pancreatic adenocarcinoma is a terrible form of cancer. It's one of the worst kinds of cancer out there, and usually people die shortly after diagnosis, and it's a very painful, brutal sort of death. She went to a healing center and began calling and writing me saying that she was starting to heal. She was eating salad and steak again that she had not been able to eat before since the cancer diagnosis, and was starting to feel a lot more energy and feeling better. And she asked if I was interested in looking into this more deeply. And I said no, I didn't see anything particular that made me think that this was something that couldn't be explained by being a good responder to chemotherapy, etc. And then she began having people call and write me from around the country saying that they also had experienced a healing. Is there anything that did I want to hear the stories? I said no. I was a new young medical director and professor, and
can you tell me, did that create a little anxiety in you at the time? Can you say why you declined?
Yes. Well, first of all, I was very busy and had a lot on my plate. I also assumed initially that these stories could be explained from within the worldview that I've been trained in as a physician. It's certainly true that people have a variety of responses to chemotherapy and to different treatments. And so initially my assumption was this can be explained from within the framework that I've been trained. But over time, as people began to contact me at her suggestion and tell me they had these stories of recovery, and they were asking if I wanted to see their medical records, they're asking if I wanted to hear the stories, people started to send me these typewritten or handwritten notes and stories. And over time, I began to realize that although a number of these stories could be explained from within the framework of my training, some of them couldn't. And those began to become a curiosity for me. And I eventually concluded in 2003 that I had a responsibility to look into this more deeply. And that's what I did. So I set up 3 criteria. I did so because I was skeptical. I also had seen how when you begin to look into these stories, often they do disappear in terms of the data, in terms of verifiable information and all that sort of thing. And so I wanted to reconcile my own inner conflict around all of this. So the 3 criteria I set up were, first of all, number 1, the person had to have a medically incurable illness, according to all that we currently understand. It had to be genuinely incurable. Number 2, they had to have medically indisputable evidence of accurate diagnosis and clear evidence for recovery. And number 3, there needed to not be some other good explanation for how they got better, such as an experimental medication or something like that. So those 3 criteria became very helpful in terms of beginning to give me a path through the confusion. The early years of this research were confusing because there is a lot of chaff in with the wheat on this, in terms of discernible results, in terms of identifiable data and correct diagnosis and all of that. And so those criteria began to really separate out what's true and not verifiably true.
And so that's a real scientific framework, because you set up something that could be tested, that does have reliability, and that you can ask questions from. And so of those, how many of those cases that you've investigated, how many of the cases you've investigated meet the criteria? Can you give us a sense of how many cases were validated and are used in your book?
Yes. So at this point, I have gone deep into well over 100 cases. And this is, no one's done this before. So there's been people who have gathered reports of these amazing recoveries, but they've not collected the medical data to verify that it was an accurate diagnosis or that the recovery occurred as had been discussed, et cetera. The funny sort of chasm that exists in these cases are that medical doctors will occasionally report in a scientific journal that there was a spontaneous remission of an incurable illness, and they will put the medical data in that report, but they typically don't ask how the person got better. I mean, it's to quite an astonishing degree. And so in all the years of the 18 or 19 years that I've now been studying this, not a single patient who I have interviewed who had the medical data has ever had a doctor ask how they got better or express curiosity in that. So for example, the good doctors will say, well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it because it's working. But they're not curious about how the person got better or how they're getting better, which is astonishing. And it says a lot about how powerful the socialization process is for physicians, I think. Now, on the other side of things, there are people who have been interested in in these amazing recoveries, and they're more in the spiritual or religious camp, but they typically don't collect the medical data. And it's certainly, like I said, true that when you begin to investigate these cases, there's a lot of cases that do begin to kind of disappear because they can't be verified, or it can't be determined for sure that it was the accurate diagnosis. So there's a lot of issues, which I think goes back to the deep chasm between mind and body that we historically have in Western culture and in Western medicine, that goes back to the days of Descartes and the Enlightenment, et cetera.
One thing that I wanted to say about that is that the path that you've taken, is really a new path, and so you're charting new territory. But there's another way that I find it when I speak about your book to people, that people will say, oh yeah, I already know, I've heard of such cases, or I have a friend who's recovered from this or that. But again, the issue really is the science.
Right.
It's that no, there's scientific evidence. And so that's different from anecdotal evidence. There's
Right.
nothing wrong with anecdotal
Right.
evidence.
It's a place to start.
It's a place to start. But for scientific evidence, you need something that has more to do with, can we reproduce this? Is this predictable? Is it reliable? Can we ask questions from the data? And that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing.
Yes, it's a step further into a genuine science around this, which is so necessary. And the way this has been historically understood in both science and spirituality is a fascinating history in its own right. If one is on the science side of this, you call this spontaneous remission, and you're taught in medical school that these reports are basically have no scientific value. And if you're on the spiritual or religious side, you call these miracles or spiritual healing. In my view, whether you're on the science side or the spiritual or religious side, these terms are all black boxes that have not been studied by science. And so that's what's so important here. What's fascinating is if you call this spontaneous remission and consider it's just a fluke with no medical or scientific value, that's an astonishing assumption, because the word spontaneous in this context means without cause.
Right.
What is a more unscientific attitude than to assume that something has no cause? Everything has a cause. It's just that we have not been asking the questions. So when you begin to look into this and really rigorously begin to investigate what's going on in these cases, you begin to see these patterns that unfold time after time after time across all these different illnesses. And we just haven't been asking the questions. So it's actually not true that these are spontaneous. They have identifiable causes.
Yes, and that means, to me, partly what is so interesting when you look at the philosophy of science is that our philosophy of science is a cause and effect philosophy.
Right.
But then we move to saying something like spontaneous, so there's no cause, and suddenly it's not scientific. It's a belief system. It's an opinion.
Right.
So, you can get the opinion of a lot of people on a lot of things, but that's not science. That's not a cause and effect system. And of course, Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, says you have to be able to falsify something for it to be scientific. So if there's a claim, it's a hypothesis. The hypothesis has evidence, and then you test the hypothesis, and that's what you're doing. You're building a science.
Right.
Looking at this kind of healing.
That's right. Yes, and that's a very big topic, because medicine, as it's practiced in the West, historically has been rooted in 18th century biology and physics. That's really about how a pharmacologic, like a medication, the molecule of a medication sits in the receptor in the body. And that's 18th century biology and physics. Quantum physics has been around for 80 years, but the assumptions about the world and about who we are as human beings and about the relationship between the mind and body are so massive and so much of a revolution in terms of how we understand all of this, that it's hard for us yet as a culture to begin getting our minds around that and to know what kind of world is truer. So modern medicine is starting to very slowly step into modern science, which is quantum physics, but that's occurring through Silicon Valley as biotech and that sort of thing slowly begin to permeate into our consciousness and remodel everything we think. It's going to give rise to a radically different kind of scientific method based upon actual data about each individual's person and body through the sensors in the environment and that we place on our body, through the apps we have on our phone. That will be personalized around actual data from our own bodies rather than the traditional science, the Newtonian Cartesian science, which has been doing for decades small studies with often college students that may or may not have any relevance to our own real lives. And so,
of course, when you get into the Silicon Valley and all of that, then you also get into profit making. Not that the profit making is apart from hospitals and medicine, but and I don't want to go into that conversation because I always think, really, do we have to go with Silicon Valley? But yes, I know that's where it's developing. And I know also at the end of your book, you have sort of a vision of how it could look.
yes.
I'm a little skeptical of that vision myself, but, but
yeah, I mean, we're talking about big topics here because the trifecta between pharmaceutical companies and how they pay academics to do certain kinds of studies that get certain kinds of results, and how that interacts with government recommendations and lobbyists and all that. That same issue has been going on with Newtonian science for decades as well. And it's valid science, it's important science, but it's also spin science to some degree. So yes, coming through Silicon Valley is exactly that same trifecta of industry and academics and government recommendations. So that's not a new topic.
Not new. I mean, it's all very human, and we could always talk about the ethics of it, but I want to move on. So
absolutely.
But I do get the big picture on who is collecting the data.
Yes.
So I want to, really talk with you about healers and placebo effect and lots of really kind of bigger issues that I'm interested in. But first, I want to just pause and say, what did you find? I have read the book. I know what you found, but I'd like you to review for us quickly about what are the important causal issues when it comes to this surprise kind of healing, whatever. It's not exactly spontaneous healing, but let's just say it's new.
Yes, absolutely. So, and this has been historically an unmapped terrain. So this is my effort to begin mapping this. I'm sure as we continue to gather more data, that map will continue to be refined and improved. I organized Cured around the 4 pillars of healing and well-being that seemed most important from my investigation of these patients' lives. And I really went deep into each person's life. It wasn't just giving them a short paper and pencil measure to answer. This was hours and hours of interviews to discern the most important factors. So in Cured, I talk about nutrition and about how much misunderstanding there exists in Western culture about nutrition among doctors, among nutritionists, among most of us, because of, again, this trifecta between industry and academics who do the studies, and then that way that interacts with lobbyists and government recommendations around nutrition. And so these people really figured out the factors of what nutritional density looks like in a way that genuinely can provide a healing role for the body and the microbiome. So that's the first pillar and a very big topic in its own right. The second pillar is the pillar of healing the immune system. That's very relevant in the time of COVID. But what's true is the immune system does a lot more than just heal infections or prevent us from pathogens like bacteria or viruses. It's our defense against the world. It's what creates the barriers and the protection and this whole army of brilliantly organized subtypes and soldiers of a type of specialized cell types that go in and fight off not only infections, but also prevent us from cell mutations that become cancer, or from other illnesses where the immune cells end up attacking the body. Most of the illnesses from which people suffer, including all the major killers, are autoimmune illnesses, which by definition is the immune cells are attacking that which it's sworn to protect, which is the body, instead of the cell mutations or et cetera. So for example, if a person has heart disease or diabetes or cancer, or then one of the many types of autoimmune illnesses, those are autoimmune illnesses, and the immune system is very much playing a huge role in those diseases. So again, the immune system is a much bigger deal than just fighting off an infection.
I must say that in my business of psychotherapy, I find the same thing about the defensive system that people have with their personalities. Those defenses which form in our early growing up become irrelevant to our current grown-up form, but they're overreactive often. So it's so funny to me. It's interesting.
Yes.
This analogy between the immune system and the personality. And I'm sure we'll find out much more in the future about that. But you're right in saying that autoimmune reaction, it just seems across the board to be at the basis of problems.
It's really true. Most of our illnesses, what I have come to realize is a person doesn't have heart disease or diabetes or lung disease or cancer or an autoimmune illness. What they really have is chronic inflammation throughout their body that then starts to cause their bodily organs to have problems one after the other. And so it's the chronic inflammation is the immune system gone awry by definition. It's the immune cells that create that chronic inflammation. So yes, your point is absolutely spot on.
And then I know you're going to move on to your other two pillars. And so please go ahead. Yes.
Right. Yes. So the third pillar is healing the stress response. And I say it that way because it's not just about alleviating stress. It's also about knowing when we need to change our relationship with stress. Running a marathon can be challenge stress in the sense that it helps us reach into our higher self, expand our understanding of what we're capable of, and increase the window of healthy physiology that allows us to manage higher levels of stress. But if a person's in a toxic relationship, or if you come home every day from work feeling like you're not good enough, or you have a partner that is tearing you down day after day after day, in a way that you end up feeling like you don't matter, or you don't have value, or you can't experience what's really right and good about you, then that's toxic stress. And that's something that a person needs to consider, maybe not changing the relationship with the stress, but leaving that stressor behind. And so there's a lot to consider in terms of how to relate one's self to stress. And it's a very different physiology to be soaking your beautiful immune cells in the stress hormones of cortisol and norepinephrine or adrenaline every day, versus the parasympathetic hormones and neurophysiology of oxytocin, the love molecule, serotonin, the antidepressant molecule, or dopamine, the pleasure and purpose pathway. That's a very different kind of neurophysiology that causes one's immune cells to wake up and function properly and to heal. So that's another big topic.
Yeah.
The fourth pillar is the most important one from my standpoint. This is the pillar where people sit up straight and look me in the eye, and their eyes begin to shine, and they get excited as they tell me about why they are so grateful in retrospect for this nearly fatal illness that they had, because this is the gift of the illness, which was to heal their identity or their false beliefs and help them wake up to the value and the goodness of what they bring into the world.
Mhm.
So
And that fourth one is where I want to start to interact with the idea of a healer and so on.
yeah,
But with each one of these, there's a deeper conversation. And I know when you and I spoke before, we even talked about the issue of people blaming themselves because they haven't engaged in the correct diet, in the correct response
yes,
to stress, etc. And so I just want to emphasize that your book and you and I all agree that none of this is about, oh, I should have done this or that. It's more that we're all discovering things
yes,
together, which we really didn't know. And it is the case that I think the medical model, as the way Western medicine practices it, is a bit aging or aged or whatever. However, that doesn't mean that any particular doctor isn't using other skills as
right,
well,
yeah,
And so I just want to be sure that people don't take this information in a way that they blame themselves or that they feel that somehow it could have been so different had they met you or met me or gone somewhere, because those circumstances, they're simply more complex than any of us can control.
yes, that's absolutely a critical point. Doctors are dying from the same illnesses as their patients. And so if doctors don't know how to heal themselves, there's no way they can teach a patient how to heal. And if a doctor has been given a misunderstanding about genuine nutrition, then they're going to be providing their patients with a misunderstanding of nutrition. And there's no way a patient can blame themselves when they've been given misinformation, even by a nutritionist who has the same misunderstanding many times. So these are issues where all of us have been operating with a misunderstanding, and we can all do better once we know better, but we certainly shouldn't be blaming ourselves for things that we just simply were doing the best we could with the knowledge we've been given.
Right, right. And life is always kind of a bootstrapping. You're always kind of bootstrapping your way along. And,
Mhm.
so I just want to be sure that people have that understanding before we go forward here, because there are a couple of things that I think are really critical in terms of looking at the bigger picture about how one gets help. And this is
Yeah.
where I want to go right now. So first of all, I want to talk about healers, because uh, that's a large conversation on its own.
Mhm.
And a lot of people refer to themselves as healers. Like, I would not refer to myself as a healer. I refer to myself as a psychotherapist. I hope my activity leads to healing, but I wouldn't use that as my identification. But
Mhm.
I understand other people do. And I'm trying to ferret out all of the meanings on this. In your book, I think it's fascinating that you encounter some healers who look at first like they're very powerful and they're having good effects, and then they may turn out to be flawed. And then there are others that may not look so impressive at first view that turn out to be powerful. And I wonder if you can talk about the way you understand, and here I'm going to say specifically the kind of healer who is offering to deal with medical intuition, with healing outside of the
Mm.
typical framework, with putting together a community like the one in Brazil
Mhm.
that treats people who have failed in the medical environment. So could you talk to us about what you think is effective in looking among those people, if you're, because I know there are plenty of people who are looking,
Yes.
and then what's not so effective and what you learned in your journey, really, from Brazil through, I can't remember where in the Midwest, but
Right. Sure. Yes. Yeah. I've interviewed and been in close contact with a lot of healers at this point. And I think the one you mentioned just a minute ago in the Midwest is Dr. Issam Nemi,
yes.
Nemeh. in Cleveland, Ohio. He's a physician trained as an anesthesiologist who does have a healing practice now and has amazing things that happen with his patients. And I've collected medical data from people he's worked with, and he collects medical data because he's a scientist himself. He was first an engineer who then went to medical school and is deeply spiritual. So he blends these worlds a lot more than most healers, just simply because of his background in science and medicine. But yes, you're right. It's a really big topic. I think one thing it's important to understand is that healing comes from within all of us. I think it's not something that a healer does to us as much as activates what's within all of us already. And sometimes it just happens more quickly or more easily if someone who has this healing capacity makes contact with that part of us that already exists within us. So it's not something that the healer does to us as much as activating what's within. It's also important to understand that healers are human beings like the rest of us, and they may have this power that is more real and verifiable in some than in others. But they're human beings, and they are prone to the same strengths and weaknesses that any of us are. Spiritual power is a temptation as much as worldly political power or financial power and that sort of thing. So there is a shadow side to all of this that one needs to be aware of. A person may have, for example, this healer in Brazil is a good example of somebody who I could verify that from a scientific standpoint and from the standpoint of verifiable medical evidence, I could demonstrate that healings had occurred in the context of work with this person. But he's now in prison for alleged sexual assaults and improprieties there. So
could you say his name? Is it, I mean, because
yeah, sure. Yeah, John of God is in Brazil, was somebody that was very confusing for me for a number of years because I could verify that medical healings were occurring, but at the same time, he told me that more than 90% of the people that came to see him were healed, and I knew on the basis of my work it wasn't anything close to 90%. But again, healings were occurring, just not at that level. And when I said that to him, he said, "Oh yeah, that's just for the popular press." Well, I said, you can't say it if it's not true. So, so we had. So that was
something, it was that, would you say, I mean, one thing that I concluded from reading is that Dr. Name was more modest. I mean, there was a kind of again, I'm trying to help people be able to, and I don't know if there's a guideline here, but there's in all of the spiritual practices, and I, have been a Buddhist practitioner since in my young 20s. And so I've met a lot of teachers. There is the at least in Buddhism, there is the recognition that you're not doing this, it's coming through you. It's not, so if you claim it as part of your own ego or identity, that's a mistake. And it's hard perhaps for people to recognize that distinction, maybe even the practitioners themselves. It sounds like you may have found some people who were more modest and careful about what they said, and then others who were less. I don't know if that's a guideline. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right that this is something that the authentic healers will say comes through them. It's not from them. It's also true that sometimes healers will say that, but they can be seduced by the ego trips that occur with this and by the power that they are granted by those who enable them or are invested in what has grown up around them and remain silent. Unopposed power is dangerous for all of us, including for spiritual healers. And so I think it's important to understand that sometimes a person may even say that this comes through them from God or from the divine, but they still may develop a inflated sense of self or ego around this that still needs some accountability and people who care about them, but also help them address the shadow side or the human side of this that remains um, a possible concern for them.
Now, if you were to advise people, I mean, just sort of thinking that people listening to this interview, I'm sure some of the people listening are people who have difficult illnesses or are facing something with their children or perhaps their parents about illnesses that can't be treated by standard medical approaches, or they're exhausted in doing those approaches. Do you have advice if somebody wants to look for, or look online or look out there and ask friends or so on? What's your advice for, let's say, how to find a effective and reputable healer, or how to find someone that might be trustworthy? There must be some guidelines from what you've learned.
Yes, absolutely. So it's very common that when a person is diagnosed with an incurable illness, especially something like cancer, since cancer has a lot of symbolic power and emotion associated with it in Western culture, such a person is often bombarded with well-intentioned friends and family who say, well, I've heard of this healer, or I've heard of this approach, or there's this book. And that can become overwhelming in its own right. And well-intentioned friends and family can feel very strongly that perhaps their loved one should pursue a certain path of healing or treatment and see a particular healer or something, but it doesn't mean it's right for that person. So to begin creating some discernment about what's right for a particular person, what's critical is that the person pursues a path that feels authentic and right for them, and they do it for their own reasons, for themselves, and not to please someone else. This is a really big topic. It's surprising, for example, that when a person is diagnosed with an incurable illness and told they have something like 6 or 12 months to live, the initial reaction is often fear, of course. But what's surprising is how often their response also is, oh, if I've only got 6 months to live, maybe I don't have to take over the family business like mom is pushing me to do, or maybe I don't have to go to law school like my parents are wanting me to do. And that decision to not respond to the perceived expectations of others and instead begin to say, well, if I've only got this many months left, I'm going to do what really matters to me. I'm not going to try to please anyone else at this point. That death of a less authentic self in order that a more authentic self can be born is such an astonishing place to investigate further, because what's wild is that sometimes time begins to go by and a person begins to live, sometimes for the first time in their life, instead of responding to everyone else's needs and perceived expectations. So this is a really big thing we're talking about. So a person that's looking for a path towards healing needs to do what's authentically right for them and not more of the same, of just responding to what others seem to be pushing them to do or demanding of them.
Well, so there are a couple of questions here that I think are important. I mean, certainly what you just now said is true also of diet changes, exercise changes, because sometimes people will go all out into one of those, which may be misaligned with various other things in their lives.
Right.
But, there's the issue of projecting authority to the outside of oneself. That is an issue all along in adult life. When we're children, we have to do that. There's no question that our authority has to be outside of ourselves. We don't have an overview of life yet.
Right.
But once we get to be adult, we actually have authority that comes from our internal sense of ourselves, where we stand in relation to the world, others, and so on. And
Yes.
very often when people get ill, or even when their lives start to fail, they want to find others that tell them
Yes.
how they should get out of this thing rather than look to themselves. And I think, again, what you're saying is when you get a diagnosis of a fatal illness, many times that kind of activates something. It's,
Yeah.
it's what Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins calls an ontological shock. He says
Yes.
that what these psilocybin treatments that they do at Johns Hopkins will often activate this shock. And so then the person has a different experience of where the authority lies.
Right.
So it's like having that internal authority is something that often gets lost when people are ill or when they have a fatal diagnosis. But then if the person decides, well, I do want to find out if this community in Brazil is effective, or if this healer in Cleveland is effective, um, if a person goes in that direction, do you have something you'd say about, there's no license for the,
Mhm.
there's
Right.
no place you could check on, I don't think, at least, maybe there is on the internet, but, where you can check, is this person valid, or what would you recommend people use as a guideline there?
Yeah, I think talking to others who have seen the results of working with a particular healer is really important. Just like we should seek the reputation, the verifiable reputation and standing of psychotherapists and physicians. The same is true for a spiritual healer as well. Is it possible to talk to people who've had genuine recoveries from their work with this person? Is there anything verifiable that one can examine? So, and paying attention to one's own inner response, because you're absolutely right. It's a big topic to be looking for an external solution versus finding a path internally that feels like it's aligned with who we genuinely, authentically are as a human being.
Mhm.
Our lives, for every one of us, doesn't matter who we are, our lives are at their best a process of dying in order to be born as a more authentic version of who we are. And so to let the false self within us that's been trying to take care of everyone else instead of ourselves, for example, or to meet expectations of others instead of responding to the deeper, more authentic needs of our own deeper soul. Those are very different pathways, and people who recover almost universally go through this path of dying to a false self in order that a more authentic version of who they are can be born.
And that's really quite similar to near-death experiences.
Mm.
But I will come back to that. Where I want to go now is so when you talked about this, you're calling it spiritual healing, or this sense that's embodied by the healer of something that seems to be coming through the healer.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about that in regard to what we call placebo effect. Now, I know that placebo effect is a very big topic. And I'm just going to say right off that I know the science of it fairly well, not probably as well as you know it, but I have been reading and studying. And so it's no longer just a matter of the sugar pills and we try this and it doesn't, it's gone way beyond that.
Yes.
We know now that fake surgeries can help as much as the real surgery. We know that a component of many medicines that seem to be simply chemically active, a component of those medicines is placebo effect, and we know it from the studies that have been done.
Yes.
So, I tend to use the word hope in terms of placebo. There are many other words. I mean, I think also transference is a word that could be used. I think that the idea that something seems promising and that it seems promising in a surprising way
Yes.
activates something in the healing process. And so I wonder if you can talk about placebo effect, how you understand it, and whether this could be what these healers have command of somehow or are tapping into.
Yes. Well, placebo is a box that contains many different kinds of activation of the mind. And the mind is so much more powerful than we traditionally have understood that to be in the West. They've been mapping the possibilities of the mind for thousands of years in Eastern culture, for example, and in some aspects of Western culture. But in the West, for the most part, we have emphasized physical laws and physical understanding of the body that has ignored the possibilities of the mind and not sought to map the possibilities of the mind at a deeper level. So that is a big topic. Can you ask your question again? I'll try to walk into.
Well, so here's what I'm wondering, because I'm trying to put two things together, and I realize sometimes in my interviews, I'm thinking through all these things myself. So
Yeah,
I'm
right.
sort of, I'm trying to move you as far as I can in this.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
I'm
Right.
wondering if you have imagined that the healer, the really effective healer,
Mm-hmm.
has some command of placebo effect. And I'll tell you one reason why. I mean, I've thought about this in many ways, but I went to see this magician whose name I think is Baron Brown. I can't remember his name at the moment. He's an English guy, and he uses illusion, but it's not sleight of hand.
Huh.
And he is working with the audience and setting them up. And then he uses essentially like a hypnotic illusion,
Mm-hmm.
but he brings the whole audience into it. And there's no question that we see things that happen that could not have happened otherwise.
Yes.
And he sets it up so that people in advance are both skeptical of him and believing him. And so I wondered, in seeing him, I started wondering, well, healers, good healers, and I could say even myself, sometimes I want people to be skeptical of what I'm doing in therapy, but I want them to believe I can help them.
Yes.
So I'm putting something together, and I'm just wondering if you can imagine that this power that healers have is somehow connected to placebo.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big topic. When I was investigating one of the healers, for example, John of God, I'll give a case from him, since this is, we've already talked about him. So he has this long history of inserting a hemostat, which is a surgical instrument, into the nostril of the patient and then twisting it vigorously and saying that this is his part of his healing work. Well, I have had very bright and educated people who will swear with a lot of emotion in their voice that they know that healed them, and that they also fervently believe that that hemostat went right back into the brain. It's a very long sort of instrument. And I would show people a sagittal view of the human head and brain, and show that the nasal cavity is actually really large, goes way back in the brain, or way back in the head, and the brain curves around that, but there's a lot of room there. And that I would show with videos of this healer how he would move the hemostat from being initially vertical into a more horizontal sort of movement that very much was consistent with the way the nasal sinus is constructed in the human body. So I would explain and show this, and people would still say, no, I know what went into my brain. I know that's what healed me. And I would go, no, this is sleight of hand. It's very powerful because it's activating hope and belief and faith in the healer. But no, there's a completely rational explanation for this. But John of God would say that this was still a very powerful sleight of hand, because it caused it inspired belief and faith in the healing occurring.
And does it, I mean, I don't know what a hemostat is exactly. It's it's an instrument that is.
Yeah, it looks like a scissors. It looks like a surgical scissors. And so it's pointed at one end, and it has the two little places to put your fingers through on the other end. It's a surgical clamp, sort of, is what it is, that looks like scissors to the untrained eye.
Was the insertion painful? Would it be painful also?
Some people would report some mild pain, but not severe pain. He would typically wrap it in a little bit of gauze, and so insert the hemostat covered with gauze into their nostril, and it would, when he pulled it out, there would be a little bit of blood there. So, and some people would report an altered state while that was occurring. Some people would not.
So, I mean, I think that maybe a part of what in that case is the persuasion, or whatever you want to call it. I don't even like to think of it as persuasion. I sort of think that the world that we live in, the way we look at the material world and so on, is far more flexible than what we actually think it is. And so, you know, that this hemostat is in the real world. It is a real thing. And so he's doing something real.
Yes.
And that, I think, probably is part of the effect of the placebo effect, because it's like the surgeries where people are cured in a back surgery, a knee surgery, from a surgery that is a sham. They've just been put under, they have an incision, but nothing's been done.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, I can give example after example of exactly what you're talking about. I have seen healers, including like John of God, they will take a paring knife and cut on the cornea of a person's eye and say that they are doing spiritual surgery to operate on the illness at the level of the soul or the spirit. And the person will sometimes report a remarkable healing from that. And what's a fascinating thing is that a person who comes from the United States or from Europe and is very trained in the Western way of thinking, they will sit there, and as this knife descends on their eye, they won't blink, they won't pull away. I mean, I tend to think, wow, if this was happening to me, I would blink, I would pull away. I mean, but talking to so the power of the mind is incredible. And I would watch as healers would cut on people with a knife on their skin and that sort of thing, and people wouldn't flinch or pull away. So the power of the mind and the expectation of one's beliefs is a massively big factor here. So that's an issue. And again, you're absolutely right. Sham surgeries, we know from the this is published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. They did a very large, well-designed scientific study that compared a group of people who got the arthroscopy of the knee, which is a surgery billions of dollars worth of done every year, with a sham surgery where they just put the person under anesthesia, made a little incision on the knee and then stitched it closed, but did not do the arthroscopy procedure. And then found that the results were just as effective with the sham surgery as with the real surgery. And of course, that was at least 15 years ago, and it hasn't changed medical practice. But I mean, but these are big deals. We know that red pills are more effective than blue pills. We know that large pills are more effective than small pills. We know that surgery is more effective than pills in terms of placebo response. We know that the white coat of the doctor is important. We know that the warmth of the physician or psychotherapy is very important for prompting a powerful placebo effect. So these are all
they're all components of this
yeah.
healing power, I think.
Yes.
And you know, the interesting thing with the sham surgeries that I found particularly interesting, and it's the case with a lot of the placebo experiments, even after people know,
Yes.
it doesn't matter.
Yes. You can tell a person that this is a sugar pill, this is a placebo, and they can still get better. So it shows the power of the mind. And so I talk in Cured a little bit about some research that suggests that it's this unconscious response to a person who's perceived as a healing authority or a healing figure who may generate this unconscious cared for feeling that then activates something healing in the body. So
well, so you know, I think that all of this really bears looking at closely, along with some of these new scientific findings in near-death experience and also controlled psychedelic experiences that they're doing at Johns Hopkins. In all of these cases, you have situations in which the mind is the key factor, and it's the key factor in a way that completely overtakes a materialist explanation of the world.
that's right.
And seems to me that's the thing that's changing in science, the sort of tyranny of materialism.
That's right.
That's been around since at least the 17th, 18th century is starting to be defeated by science.
That's right. That's really true. The gift of Western culture, from my standpoint, is that we have provided the physical and an understanding of the physical laws of the universe, starting with the Enlightenment and Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity and the laws of the physical world. And that was a really important discovery. But you're right, we have, because of that, come to mistakenly believe that the physical world is the primary world, and it's not. The world of the mind, the world of the soul, these more invisible, difficult to detect from a scientific standpoint, are far more powerful, but we're just beginning to map that in the West. And so the beginning of a new era that's very exciting and will profoundly change our understanding of what helps people heal, for sure.
I believe that too. And I would say, again, we're beginning to map it scientifically.
Yeah.
I mean, I think spiritually, there have been many spiritual healers, spiritual paradigms. Even like in Buddhism, it's an empirical paradigm.
Yes.
Buddhism is a very empirical basis, but that's still not scientific. I mean, because it doesn't test across cases, it doesn't make the predictions, it can't be reliable in that way.
Right.
It was empirical and you could test it yourself, like the Buddha said, be a lamp unto yourself, test it for yourself. But the Buddha didn't say design a study and see, you know, if this works across the cases.
Yeah.
But now we can, and it's in doing work like you're doing, and I highly recommend people read your book so that they can understand how these issues come across in regard to healing.
Yes.
And to get to know that there is this much more powerful aspect to healing, recovery, resilience, and so on that has to do with the mind.
Yes.
Than many people credit, and I believe we're at a turning point in regard to this.
I believe we are. It is the beginning of an entirely new era and will dramatically transform the way we think about health and healing and well-being. Now, I want to be clear. I don't believe that we can think ourselves into health.
Right.
I think it's far more complicated than that.
Right.
However, I also believe that love is the most powerful force in the world. But it's one thing for a person to talk about love who has a lot of work to do on healing their own fear or trauma, for example, and the barriers that prevent us from experiencing love. I do believe that the soul doesn't rest until, in every one of us, the soul does not rest until it experiences unconditional love at some level. And there's a lot to that. We also have to work to not just have positive thoughts, because that's
Right,
if a person has positive thoughts on a sea of unresolved fear or trauma, there will be unconscious or conscious barriers to experiencing love there. And so to begin understanding both the higher possibilities of the human mind, but also how the rubber meets the road for this particular life and person is a place of very fertile research.
Absolutely. And, you know, I have come to understand love as that continued engagement with interest.
Yes.
It's not just a positive feeling. Love is a commitment. Love
Yes.
is a dedication. It's an engagement again and again and again with whatever you love. You know, if you loved bird watching, you
Yes.
engage with bird watching, you grow from bird watching, you become bird watching. And
Yes.
so, you know, if you love another person or you love a subject or whatever, it doesn't mean that you feel good all the time.
That's right.
With that. And
Yes.
so love isn't really a feeling, it's a dedication. And I think that when it comes to healing, the dedication has to be somehow to your life, that you
Yes.
feel your own life
That's
is
right.
interesting and wants to go on, you know, and you're dedicated to it.
Yes.
You know, your work helps so much with that. And so I want to thank you. Our time is up and it's been great talking with you. And I hope that we have something wonderful to do together in near future.
I would love every bit of that. I love what you bring to this whole discussion and the depth of your own insight and education. These are huge issues. And the important thing is what helps a person experience the dignity and unrepeatable goodness and uniqueness that they bring into the world. That's what wakes people up. That's what causes people to want to live. That's what gives a person the opportunity of a more authentic self that isn't just taking care of everyone else their whole life, and that has been associated with the breakdown of their physical body and mind. So these are big issues, and I appreciate that we can talk about it.
Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.